Okay, welcome back. This is our lecture on Isaac, and I want to say at the outset that this lecture is not required. It's not exactly supplemental material either, it's quasi-required. And what I mean by that is you don't have to watch this lecture, okay? And I will test you on none of the content in this lecture. It's not in your readings either. It's in your recommended readings, but it's not in your readings. And so you can choose to watch it or not watch it if you're, strapped for time or whatever. On the other hand, it's helpful to set up what we really do need to go through, and that is the story of Jacob, who's Abraham's grandson and Isaac's son. And that really sets up the very important concept of the 12 tribes of Israel. So this lecture is important for context, but it's not required. It's just strongly recommended, and that's why I have put it with the lecture series instead of just in the additional resources folder. So I encourage you to watch it. I encourage you even to read that material from 22 to 32 in Genesis, I believe. But I know that given the nature this is an accelerated course, we already have a lot of lecture and reading material to deal with. So I want to be sensitive to your time as much as I can while still being responsible to the expectations of the course content as laid out by the course curriculum, the core curriculum. So trying to strike that balance. I know it probably is a little bit cumbersome at time, maybe a lot cumbersome, and I apologize for that. But do your best, and we'll get through this. So Isaac, Yitzhak, remember that is Abraham's child of promise. Abraham is he was already old to begin with, and we've been through his story and how Isaac finally is miraculously given to Sarah in her old age, and that becomes the child of the covenant. Through this child, God is going to make Abraham's descendants numerous as stars in the sky, sand in the seashore, and also will bless all of the world through Isaac. So Isaac is the child of promise. Now, Abraham is really getting up in years now. His Sarah has unfortunately gone on to be with the Lord, and so he takes another wife, Keturah, which actually we have somebody in this class named Keturah. I don't know if that's your actual namesake, Keturah, but it was just interesting when I saw that. So Abraham does take another wife and continues to be rich, and by this point Isaac is a man of some years, not necessarily old, but and Abraham knows he needs a wife, and one of the reasons he needs a wife is there's this cultural expectation, but also Isaac needs to get to getting those descendants going. So he decides though that he does not want Isaac to have marry a woman from the region that God has led him. So Abraham calls his oldest and likely, most trusted servant, and he makes a covenant. And he says, place your hand under my thigh and give me this oath, or make this oath to me that you will go to my original country, my kindred. The servant's his oldest, so likely was with him back in Ur, and find my son a wife. And, of course, this is all not very romantic or very good language about how love and marriage should work, but this was a different time, not apologizing for it, but this is the way the history bore itself out. And so the placing of the hand of their thigh, that's, it's pretty hard to know exactly what that means. I don't even know how often, if at all, that custom was used. But likely, putting the hand as you're making this oath or vow close to the genitalia, there's some sort of connection to marriage or childbearing. And so given that Isaac is the child of promise from Abraham's loins, and then from Isaac's loins, this promise will continue. That's probably where the significance comes from. And so Abraham wants his servant to go back to and speak with and find a wife from that, find a woman from that area to be a wife to Isaac. And so he says specifically, no Canaanite wife. You know, the promised land, the land that God showed Abraham, is the Canaanite land. I mean, there's other groups of people there too, like the Philistines and stuff. But this is the Canaanite, is, you know, it's Canaan is the land that it's called at that time. And Abraham just does not want Isaac to have a Canaanite wife. And this becomes an ongoing theme. Isaac does the same thing. And so there's something interesting going on. Probably has to do with what's coming later in the wars with the Canaanites. But that's kind of beyond the scope here. So, but there's this weird, interesting thing too. It's not weird, but there's this interesting thing too that Abraham also tasks him: don't let Isaac go there with you. Don't let him go. So I want you to find a woman from that land that he can marry, but I don't want him going back. And so we see two kind of interconnected things that are interconnected in two ways, or excuse me, to two different things in this narrative. One is, of course, the cultural expectations of the time. So we've already talked about descendants. Land is also the other most important thing that you must have in the world. If you were to be considered to be a fruitful, successful person, a blessed person in the ancient world, you want to have descendants and you want to have land. And then it also has to do with the covenant itself. God's covenant to Abraham is a blessing, and is a blessing of land, the promised land, so to speak. That's why it's called the promised land, and descendants. So he doesn't want Isaac going because Isaac needs to stay with the land. It's very, very crucial. This gets at that kind of covenantal, the organicness of covenant versus contract. And so he sends the servant back to and he gets there, and he does this little, prayer. He sets by a well, and he says, hey, God, or he doesn't even say God. It's a very ancient sort of thing. He says, the Yahweh, the God of my master Abraham. The next, the women are coming to fill up the buckets from the well. If you would just, I'm going to ask one of them for a drink, and if she says yes, and then waters my camels as well, she's going to be the one. And so, of course, this happens, and it's Rebecca. Now, it's interesting too, a few things about Rebecca. So we don't get to spend as much time with Isaac and Rebecca as we do with Abraham and then Jacob. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the patriarchs, but it's the two bookends are really the get the most story. But this woman Rebecca is interesting because Rebecca, it comes from the same root of Adikah, which, as we talked about in the last lecture, means binding, and it has to do with the binding of Isaac, the moment where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac to God. And the other thing is she is a virgin. Now, of course, this has to do with cultural expectations and stuff like that. But that's not what the Bible's worried about. What's key here is that her child can only be from the line of Abraham and Isaac, because that is the bloodline of promise. So that's why the virginity aspect is important. And then also she is from Abraham's family. She's from the family of Nahor, I can't remember exactly, but who was Abraham's father. And so Laban, who is Rebekah's brother, and he comes back into the story with Jacob, is likely Abraham's nephew, which makes Rebecca likely Abraham's niece, and Isaac likely her cousin. Now, I know that it is, I know that the ancient people knew about incest, but there is also a sense of keeping bloodlines pure. And when it comes to this covenantal aspect, this was seen as very, very important. So I'm not going to get into why this is okay or not okay. Well, incest is not okay. But why this was a practice in the ancient world or why this is in the scriptures, that's really just not interesting to me. What's interesting to me is the covenantal and then, of course, mythological and theological meaning. And so we have this covenantal phrase coming out of the servant's mouth when he's so excited to find out Rebecca is of the family. She's a virgin, and she is extraordinarily well suited for Isaac. So, he gives this prayer: Blessed be the Lord, blessed be Yahweh, the God of my master Abraham, who has not who has not forsaken, his chesed. Remember chesed, that covenantal love term, and his faithfulness towards my master. This is all deeply covenantal. And so the servant takes Rebecca back, and there's a little bit of a moment with the family, like, are you just going to take her? You can't just take. Give us like 10 days with her. And he's like, nope, gotta go now. Gotta go now. And they're like, all right, well, what will she say? And she says, yeah, I'll go. So she goes, and so he brings her back, and then Isaac and her get married, and they have 2 children, which we will talk about in the next lecture. But in the meantime, what is important is that the covenant is continued. And that covenant is the same exact covenant is given to Isaac that was given to Abraham. That is, I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to give you descendants as numerous as the sand of the sea, the sand of the seashore, the stars of the sky, and through your descendants, I am going to bless everyone. All the world will be blessed through your descendants. Now, this is important again because this is what we are calling God's solution to the fall. This blessing is going to be the solution. Thus, this covenant is God's promise to bring forth the solution. Third, this solution, as Israel begins to work out later on in its history, although there's prophecies and pieces of it all sprinkled out throughout the entire Hebrew Scriptures, is the Messiah, the Mashiach, the anointed one or chosen one of God. And for the Christian tradition, that is Jesus. So Jesus is the culmination of this covenant. This covenant made with Abraham and Isaac is ultimately, according to Christians, not to Jews, but to Christians, the fulfillment of this covenant. And so, now we turn to something of great soap operatic value in terms of narrative in the next bit of our story, which is the interesting story of Jacob and his brother Esau and his wives, and that leading to his son Joseph. And so, if you made it this far in the lecture, well done, and I will see you next time.